Topic today is an uncomfortable topic, but is extremely important topic. If any of you have not been watching carefully what's happening in the relationship between the U.S. and China, if you're just watching your feed on your smartphone or on the screen, it's slightly confusing, maybe even makes you a little dizzy. And if you've been watching very carefully, which I have, you'll also seem a little dizzy or a little confused, because there's been more change in the views about the relationship between the U.S. and China in the last 2 years than in the previous generation. So those of you who haven't watched Washington recently, a country, China, which was, when Obama left office, described as a strategic partner of the U.S., that was the official designation, is now officially designated by the Trump administration a strategic adversary. So in a word, my friend has become my foe. And this is not simply the rhetoric of the official literature of the Trump administration, though it is, but it's also a view that's come to pervade the political class in Washington, Democrats and Republicans alike. Indeed, there's almost only one thing on which Washington politicians can agree, and that's that China is the problem. If you look at the bellwether folks like Dianne Feinstein, who's been one of the leaders in trying to have a constructive relationship between the U.S. and China, she's now being very tough on China and trade in other arenas. So, and in Beijing, there's a kind of a period of reflection about, well, what did we do wrong, or did we do something wrong, or why is this changed, or how much is this change, or how deep is this change? So to try to help us get our mind around what's happening and to better understand what's happening, I'm going to offer today a big idea, and I'm going to propose an even bigger challenge. And I'm going to hope that in the conversation that follows, or maybe in the period after, if you have a chance to reflect on it, that some of you will actually come up with some ideas. So the big idea is Thucydides' trap. That's the rivalry between a rising power, like China, and a ruling power, like the U.S. And the even bigger challenge is the subtitle of this book: How America and China Can Escape Thucydides' Trap. That is, how we can manage a relationship between a rising China and a ruling U.S. without it ending in a tragic war. So someone who picked up this idea immediately and understood it very well is the leader of China, Xi Jinping. And here he is at Davos in January of 2017. And what he says, I think, I agree with every sentence. So he's talking about trying to build what he calls a new form of great power relations. And as one of the people who works directly for him, whom I have been chatting with recently, he always says to me, Graham, why do you think Xi Jinping calls for a new form of great power relations? And it's because he understands that the old form, following in the paths of history over the centuries, generally ends in war. So as he says here, we've got to construct some new form of great power relations, but that if we do so, we can escape Thucydides' trap. We can escape being dragged into a war that would be terrible for everybody and that nobody wants. And I would say, write about the problem. We need a new form, not business as usual, and write about the fact that we could, if we were smart and imaginative, find a way to escape Thucydides' trap. Now, I'll try to stimulate your imagination on the question of how to do that. So here's an overview of what the next 40 minutes is going to be about. First, what's the big idea? Second, is China rising or risen? Third, how's China's rise impacting? How is it impacting the U.S. and the international order of which the U.S. has been the principal architect and guardian? Fourth, how can this Thucydidean dynamic in the rivalry lead to a war no one wanted and everyone knows would be catastrophic? Fifth, is war between the U.S. and China inevitable? Six, where do we stand now, today, in this Thucydidean drama? And finally, seven, the big challenge, how to escape Thucydides' trap. So, tweet size, the big idea, Thucydides' trap. Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power, like Athens, that's what Thucydides was writing about, or China today, threatens to displace a ruling power, like Sparta in classical Greece, or the U.S. today. Is China rising or risen? The answer is yes. China is rising and continuing to rise, but it's also already risen to be the largest national economy in the world, measured by PPP. Third, how's this impacting the U.S. and the international order? Well, as China grows bigger and stronger, inevitably and inescapably, it's encroaching on prerogatives and positions that Americans have come to think of as their natural right after 100 years of the American century. So this is impacting Americans' consciousness about who they are and America's positions and prerogatives in every domain. Fourth, how can a Thucydidean dynamic lead to a war when nobody wants a war? And interestingly, in the historical pattern, rarely has either the rising power or the ruling power initiated a war, wanted a war. Instead, what's happened is some third party's action, some extraneous event, becomes a provocation that one or the other of the major competitors feels obliged to respond to, that triggers a spiral that ends in a war. And for us, in thinking about U.S. and China, we should think about how the U.S. and China stumbled their way into a war in 1950 on the Korean Peninsula, which was not a war that Mao wanted and not a war that Truman wanted, but was a war that occurred as a result of North Korea invading South Korea, and then you know the rest of the story. So is war between the U.S. and China inevitable? No. So let me say this loudly. No. War between the U.S. and China is not inevitable. So many people misinterpret this proposition. I'm absolutely passionate about this. War is not inevitable. But if a war occurs, for failures of the leaders in China and the U.S. to do things that they could have done, they will not be able to blame some iron law of history. They won't say, history made me do it. It'll be because of mistakes that are made by Chinese and Americans, mistakes that we could have done otherwise. Sixth, where do we stand in this drama? I was here in Beijing for 10 days just before Christmas, and I had a chance to talk to people across the government as well as in the think tanks and the universities. And when I got back to the States, I was going off on vacation for Christmas, but I got a phone call from somebody who works directly for President Trump, and he said, Graham, you were in China for 10 days. What's the takeaway? What did you learn? I said, well, I'm going to be on vacation as of an hour from now, but I'll give you the short summary. If Thucydides were watching what's happening in the relationship between the US and China, he would say, this looks like the most spectacular rising power I ever saw, that's accelerating towards the most comprehensive and determined ruling power I've ever seen. And so here's an unstoppable force accelerating towards an immovable object. I'm anticipating the grandest collision of all time. And finally, how to escape Thucydides' trap? Well, that's where I'm hoping some of you are going to have some ideas. I'll give you a couple of my own. So, Thucydides. Yes, I know this is a mouthful, and that many people have difficulty pronouncing this fellow's name. So let's do it in unison. 1, 2, 3. Thucydides. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Thucydides. Okay. So who's Thucydides? Thucydides is the father and founder of history. He wrote the first ever history book. It's called The History of the Peloponnesian War. And it's about the war that occurred in classical Greece that destroyed the two leading city-states. Thucydides had many, many big ideas. Here's one, what I call Thucydides' trap. So this is Thucydides' insight. I'm simply popularizing it by giving it the name Thucydides' trap. It's the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, like Athens or Germany 100 and a few years ago before World War I, or China today threatens to displace a ruling power like the US. So is China a rising power or a risen power? So this is a graphic I produced to illustrate what's happened in one of the miracles that I celebrate for China in the period since its opening in 1978. And I call this the pyramid of poverty. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as $2 a day per person. So that's below $2 a day is abject poverty. In 1978, at the time of the opening to China, what percentage of all Chinese were struggling to survive on less than $2 a day? Take a guess. So the answer is 90%. 9 out of every 10. Now, in the 40 years since 1978, what's happened to this pyramid of poverty? It's essentially been flipped on its head. So today, the number is less than 1%. So China is serious about eliminating abject poverty. And this is a fantastic achievement for China and for the world. That 700 or 800 million people who would have had miserably poor lives now have a little bit more in their diet and a little bit more dignity in their life. So, still rising or risen. This is a bridge at Harvard University that goes across the Charles River that I can see when I look out my office at the Kennedy School. And it goes between the Kennedy School and the business school. So the renovation of this bridge began in 2012. It was a 2-year project. It was said it was going to create a big traffic jam, but it would be done in 2 years. In 2014, they said it wasn't finished. It would take another year. 2015, they said it wasn't finished. They wouldn't tell us when it's going to finish. 2017, they finally finished it 3 times over budget. So in Beijing here, there's a bridge called the Sanyan Bridge, S-A-N-Y-A-U-N. It has about twice as many lanes of traffic as the Harvard Bridge. In 2016, the government of Beijing decided to renovate it. How long did it take for it to complete the renovation job? Take a guess. The answer is 43 hours. You could go to YouTube, 43 hours. So rising or risen, the answer is you bet. What's the impact of the rise of China on the U.S. and on the international order, of which the U.S. has been the principal guardian? This is a cartoon I made in 2014 for Senator John McCain and his Armed Services Committee when they were holding hearings on the Obama administration initiative to Asia. So some of you remember the Obama administration's initiative to Asia. Do you remember the name of it? Well, what was it called? It was called the Pivot, or sometimes called the Rebalance. And what President Obama said was that the U.S. should put less weight on its left foot in the Middle East fighting wars in order to put more weight on our right foot in Asia, where the future is. So I said in this testimony, well, this is an important point, and I agree with President Obama's point, but what we should notice is that while we've been debating whether we should put more weight on our left foot or on our right foot, the seesaw on which we've been sitting has actually been lifted to the point that neither of our feet are on the ground. So here in 2004, China is about half the GDP of the US. Again, this is in PPP. 2014, slightly larger. 2024, half again larger. So what's the impact of the rise of China on American positions and prerogatives? You used to be on the top end of the seesaw, and I could bounce you around. Now I've got my feet off the ground, and you can bounce me around. So what about trade? In 2000, beginning of the century, every one of the Asian countries' principal trading partner was who? The U.S. And today, 2018, the principal trading partner of every Asian country is who? China. Well, that means China is the principal partner for trade for Australia. China is the principal partner for trade for Singapore. China is the principal partner for trade for Korea, for Japan. And as a consequence, Americans who thought we should own that market have been nudged out. American products that thought they should like to dominate that market are now not dominating that market. The political influence that flows from this economic relationship shouldn't be underestimated. So today, when people in the Trump administration talk about some decoupling or isolating China from the global economy, people in Asia say, what are you talking about? Don't imagine you can make us choose between our security relationship with you and our economic relationship with China, which is essential for our prosperity. This is a quiz I give my students at Harvard. Won't be a very interesting quiz for you here, but I just give it to you as a point of perspective. So I have a list of 46 indicators that ask the question, when could China become number one? Americans know that we are number one. We belong as number one. That's who we are. So people have to fill in the right-hand column their estimate of what year China could overtake the US. And they say 2025, 2030, not in my lifetime. And then I show them the answer is already. All these things have already happened. So China already has the most billionaires. China already has the fastest supercomputer. China already has the largest GDP, measured by the best yardstick for comparing national economies, according to the IMF and the CIA. So what's the impact of this on the US? It's encroaching on positions and prerogatives that Americans have come to imagine are their birthright. So how does this usually work out? In the book, Destined for War, I review the last 500 years of history. I find 16 cases in which a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, a major ruling power. 12 of the cases end in war. 4 of the cases in no war. So you can go online to the Thucydides trap case file at Harvard and see the cases, see a longer discussion of the cases, see the reference to the authoritative historical sources from which they come and some of the disputes. So 4 of the cases, no war. So war is not inevitable. Let's say it again. Not inevitable. Okay? Now, how then does war happen between a rising power and a ruling power, especially in a case where both of them know war makes no sense and where neither wants a war? And that's certainly the case of the US and China today. So good news, there's nobody in China that thinks China can achieve its dream and ambitions by a war with the US. And fortunately, there's nobody in Washington who thinks that the US can achieve its objectives by a war with China. So how does war happen? 3 layers in the dynamics. First, the reality, the material reality. China really is getting bigger and stronger, and if and as it does, it is actually materially impacting the US. The seesaw is shifting. China is becoming the dominant trading partner. China does have the fastest supercomputer, blah, blah, blah. So that's the reality. Second level, perceptions. So as the reality is processed through perceptions and the psychology of the perceiver and the emotions, as Thucydides wrote, this can often instill fear, even exaggerated fear. So there's perceptions and misperceptions as the reality is awakened to. And then finally, there's politics, the political struggle within both the rising power and the ruling power by individuals seeking to rule themselves, seeking to be in charge of China or in the US. And in a political competition, the worst position is to have a competitor to your right on a security issue. So if it's a security issue, I should be more true to my country than my competitor. And as a consequence, people struggle to be tougher than the other party, especially on national security issues. We stack those 3 things together, the material reality, the misperceptions and miscalculations that come as this is processed, and then the politics, and you have a dynamic that becomes extremely vulnerable to third-party actions or even accidents that are extraneous, but one or the other feels obliged to respond to. That leads to a spiral, ends in a war. I have a good chapter in the book on 1914, and I don't think you can study 1914 too carefully. In 1914, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo, which seemed inconsequential to everybody, ended up being the spark that produced a conflagration that burned down essentially the whole of Europe, and from which Europe really never recovered. So in the US-China competition, we should look carefully at potential third-party provocations that could drag the two of us somewhere we don't want to go. And a good candidate is things happening in Taiwan. So if Taiwan should make a significant move towards independence, what is China going to do? And if China does that, what is the US going to do? And could those two things lead the two parties into a war? I believe they could. North Korea. What was happening, at least until North Korea stopped its ICBM tests and nuclear tests, was about to provoke Trump to attack North Korea. If he had attacked North Korea, would we likely have had a second Korean War? We probably would have. What happened in the first Korean War? Remember, Americans and Chinese killed most of each other. Most of the Americans who died in the Korean War were killed by Chinese. And most of the Chinese who died in the Korean War were killed by Americans in a war that Americans and Chinese didn't want. So third-party actions or provocations can produce a war that nobody wants. How to escape Thucydides' trap just to provoke you. So I'm looking for a better idea, but I'll give you two ideas just to suggest things on the list. First, this came from a Chinese colleague. He said, why don't we externalize the problem and say the problem we face, both Chinese and Americans, is this Thucydidean dynamic. We are a rising power. You are a ruling power. This rivalry does create vulnerability to third-party actions. So let's recognize that fact and deal with it. So in the book, I say, and I believe this, that this challenge is not a problem to be solved like a disease you have. You get a pill and the disease goes away. This is a chronic condition that has to be managed. So in a chronic condition, I live with it, but I manage it, and I have to take account of it. So what would that mean for this option? Three things and a question mark. First thing, recognizing the vulnerability that arises from the Thucydidean dynamic. Ruthlessly realistic about the systemic risk. Not because China wants a war, not because the US wants a war, but in a rivalry between a rising and ruling power, this inevitably creates a systemic risk of being dragged to a war nobody wants. Secondly, crisis prevention. Together, jointly working to prevent crises that could become the trigger that drag the two parties to a war they don't want. So, working together on North Korea, working together on Taiwan, working together actually on rules of engagement for the South China Sea. Thirdly, crisis management. Preparing for crises that are going to occur even if we do our best to try to prevent them. And that means having communication channels, that means working through scenarios together, that means actually having multi-layers of conversation so that you have not just presidents to presidents, but military to military and local commander to local commander. So a whole group of crisis management. And then plus, question mark, do we need something more than that, in addition to that, some new strategic concept that explains to ourselves what we're doing in this relationship? Well, maybe. Option two, again briefly, is a combination of a Chinese idea and an American idea articulated by John F. Kennedy. So the Chinese idea is called rivalry partnership and was explained to me by a Shanghai Chinese historian, which described the relationship between the Song and the Liao at around 1,000 years ago. And actually in a treaty that they negotiated in 1004 called Chayan Treaty. They agreed to be rivals in some arenas and partners in other arenas. Now that's a pretty strange idea, and certainly in diplomacy it seems odd, but in the business world, they even have a term they call co-opetition. So you compete ruthlessly with your competitor in one market, and you partner up with him in joint ventures in another market. So Apple and Samsung are good examples. They're ruthless competitors selling smartphones. Actually, Samsung has now beat Apple out in terms of total smartphone sales. But also, Samsung is the biggest supplier to Apple. So how can my competitor both be my supplier? Well, life is complicated, so rival partnership. And John Kennedy had a version of an idea like that after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, most dangerous episode in history. Kennedy thought he just about had blown up the world and that we couldn't keep doing this, playing out a version of a crisis of this sort. So he, in the American University speech, which he gave just 4 months before he was assassinated, articulated a different idea. He said, we can't keep doing what we're doing. We should have a new concept of our relationship with the Soviet Union. We should settle now for a, quote, world safe for diversity. He didn't give up believing that the Soviet system was evil. He didn't give up his confidence that an American system was better, that freedom-based was appropriate, but he agreed that we can't have crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis again, so we have to build a world safe for diversity, which we can compete in some arenas and not in the other. I think that may be another thought that would be that could be spun out and developed somewhat further. So that's another one that I'm working on. So to conclude, big idea, Thucydides' trap. As Henry Kissinger says, if you get this lens, you can look through the news and noise of the day to the underlying dynamic. Big challenge, how to escape Thucydides' trap. The answer is, I don't know. I'm very interested. I'm looking, listening. So if you have a good idea, I'm particularly interested if you'll offer it. So thank you.